Hi everyone, my name's Stuart and I'm excited to talk today about my work revisiting recovery from the perspectives of elite athletes, including what recovery is, involves, and how they go about it. I want to thank Sport for Life for the opportunity to speak, as well as my supervisor, Dr. Bradley Young, for his support on this project. One of the principles of long-term athlete development is that success takes time. It's right there in the name, right? Long-term development, sport for life. Whether we're talking personal growth and health, or skill and performance development, the biggest benefits come with long-term, sustained sport participation, which requires sustaining motivation, enjoyment, and the ability to participate, or as an athlete, to train. Unfortunately, instead of long-term participation and development, many athletes experience negative training outcomes like burnout, overtraining, and overuse injuries. Now, I think everyone knows these outcomes are a problem we have for a long time, and we've invested time, energy, and research into understanding why they happen and what to do about it when they do happen. But why only look at the end point? What about the process that keeps getting us there? Think about any other negative health outcome. We can treat the disease or problem when things go wrong, and we're really good at that. But we can also try to understand what policies and behaviors can keep things going right, keep them on track, and avoid the problem in the first place. So let's look at the process of training. Training is a form of stress, which biologically is any disturbance from homeostasis or baseline, whatever the source, physiological, psychological, whatever. Recovery is the process of returning the body back to its baseline state. When stress is not addressed with adequate recovery, we get a downward spiral ending in those negative training outcomes that we saw. On the other hand, good, appropriate recovery allows a return to baseline, sustained health, and further adaptation. We focus a lot on the different types and amounts of stress that athletes accumulate, which is good, but the recovery process isn't a constant. It can happen gradually with time, but a lot of things can have a big impact on how effective the process is. So what can we do about this recovery process? Well, if we look to research, we see debates on the effectiveness of compression garments and cryotherapy, brain stimulation, and hyperbaric chambers. If we look to media, we see the same thing, plus a whole entourage of specialists for a single athlete. Now, as an organization, a sport organization, I would look at this and say, no thanks. I can't do that. I can't afford that. But is that it? Right? Is effective recovery just expensive tools? Are athletes just machines that need us to come in and service them every once in a while? Or is there more to it than that? What's the athlete's role in this process? If we want better athlete outcomes, we need better policies and procedures integrating recovery into the culture and values of our sport organizations. To do that, we need a better, more well-rounded understanding of recovery. We aren't working with Russell Wilson, right? We need to understand recovery in our systems and our organizations. Within that, you have to start somewhere. So I went where recovery should matter most. Endurance sports have the highest training loads, and for elite athletes, every little thing counts for getting the most out of training. Through an intensive process of multiple interviews and activity journals, I talked to some of Canada's best endurance athletes, men and women who had all competed at multiple senior worlds or Olympics, including one or more recent ones. Today I'm going to summarize early results of this ongoing project that asks these elite athletes for their perspectives on what recovery is, what it involves, and how they go about it. To understand what recovery is, let's start first with why they recover and work back from there. So at an elite level, everybody trains long, everybody trains hard, everybody's doing the same styles of workouts. And according to these athletes, the recovery in between is what makes the difference. It allows you to train well today, step back, adapt, and then come back and execute just as well tomorrow. And importantly, no one really talked about avoiding injuries or burnout. In the words of the athletes, recovery was about being better, not about running away from being worse. In short, whether we're talking within a day, a week, a month, or a year, recovery is for absorbing and adapting to the work you did and preparing the body and mind to attack the next session or the next block. Now, how do you absorb the work and prepare for more? Well, hard training is taxing in many ways, physically, mentally, emotionally, etc. And athletes describe recovery as equally multidimensional. Good recovery involved a different approach depending on the stress and fatigue experience. So most obviously, physical stress required physical recovery, mental with mental, but also different approaches for fatigue from volume versus intensity type practices or short-term versus long-term fatigue. Now, sometimes these dimensions might conflict, so needs on the mental side, like seeing friends, might go against needs on the physical side or vice versa. In this case, the athletes talked about a process of learning how to know what the priority was and what type of recovery would have the greatest effect overall. So with that purpose and process in mind, what actually constitutes recovery? The answer is whatever works. Athletes resisted separating out what counts and doesn't count as recovery because they're always thinking about how something is going to impact absorbing last session and preparing for the next one. So in this case, what counts is almost anything that helps them achieve those goals. So on the other hand, what works is specific to the athlete, to the stressor, and to the place and time. So recovery is both a broad umbrella term encompassing a huge range of possibilities, and at any given moment, there's only a very focused list of what might actually work effectively. So I'll try using some examples from the athletes to help contextualize those main points. So just to help organize things, I've mapped out two axes. First, whether the form of recovery is more physical or more mental, and second, whether it requires dialing up focus and effort or dialing it down. Now, these examples are definitely not exhaustive. They're just what the athletes mentioned, and their placing on the axes here is more about just having a visual than actual accuracy, but it should help orient us. So we can start with something basic like sleep or napping, which is beneficial both physically and mentally. Recovery was also integrated in training, so there's daily cool downs, but also weekly features like easy work, like a recovery run, rest days, light walks, light hikes, and then on a year-long scale, there's also periods of more self-directed or freedom-based training versus more regulated and intensive training like in training camps. Nutrition was huge, both daily and the stuff pre, during, and post-workout. And athletes also talked a lot about body work, whether it was done by others, like a massage or physiotherapist, by themselves, like stretching, or by using a tool like compression boots or an ice bath. Now, even just taking a break was absolutely key for recovery, a physical break and or a mental one. And the latter came in two forms. So there was zoning out from any hard thinking, but also just taking a break from thinking about their sport and themselves as an athlete. And that latter one, it overlaps with almost everything that's going to follow. Their social activities were important, so talking and being, hopefully, with family, friends, teammates, partners, coaches. There was a lot of other pursuits, either alone or with other people, like reading, baking, drawing, painting, public speaking, schoolwork, or other part-time work. Now, from a recovery sense, a lot of these other pursuits were about switching lanes. They all had in common that they're about taking a break from being an athlete and trying to feel accomplished and purposeful as a person outside of sport. Now, finally, many of the athletes had specific psychological strategies to help reduce stress. And the neatest one, the one I want to highlight, was the importance of something simple, like even like a shower, or changing your shirt, or slipping on the comfy sandals after a workout as a form of a mental cool down, or a signal to say, okay, the workout's done, now recovery starts. Right, a transition from stress to recovery. Now, what should you take from this whole mess? Well, 2 points are, first, to cover the map. It's easy to focus on one area, and we often have a tendency to, based on either as people or as organizations where our strengths lie. But if recovery is multidimensional, then we need potential strategies for all corners of the map. On the other hand, within that map, the specifics are always going to be individual. The easiest example is school and work. Right? Some athletes said, I love having a part-time job. I love having that other identity where I don't have to be athlete me. Where on the other hand, there are many athletes who said, I'm so glad I'm done working. I'm carded. I don't need to anymore. I'm glad I'm done school. It was only stress. Right? It's about what works for that athlete at that point in time. So this map shows a lot of things. It shows doing things, it shows not doing things, but we said up front that stress and recovery are a process. So it's not just about the things, it's also about how they're integrated into the bigger picture. These athletes saw themselves as the boss of that integration process. So if recovery is so integrated with everything that they do, then they're the only ones who know how things are going from moment to moment, and the only ones who can really make the right decisions on that immediate basis. Now, if I pushed a little bit, some would say, okay, yeah, I guess my coach designs my programs. I mean, I can't massage myself. But to them, from their perspective, these are systems of support. That support's absolutely crucial. They can't do the recovery without it, whether it's the support, the knowledge support of coaches, or the skill support of the therapist, or even the physical support of having the right tools to do the recovery. But the athletes didn't see themselves as end users in this recovery system, or in this support system. They saw themselves as the decision makers at the center of it. So what does this decision-making process look like? Well, I'll use the example of naps that almost every athlete talked about. So at the beginning of each training week, athletes would map out when and what the practices were and build a plan around that schedule. Now, one thing that many of them identified was this window of opportunity for napping, usually at a routine time each day. We'll say in the schedule, 1 to 1:30 was the nap time. Now, as the day goes on, they pay attention to how they're feeling and performing physically and mentally. Are they sharp? Are they dull? Are they suffering? Or are they just crushing it today? Right? They compare these feelings and this performance versus their expectations, and they rely heavily on the context of the goals of the week, the training phase, etc., to make those comparisons. But based on that, they then react and adapt to their plan. React and adapt their plan going forward. So the 20-minute nap might be switched to a 90-minute one if they're really suffering. Or if things are really good, they'll still use the opportunity. They'll lie down, they'll be there, they'll check in and say, no, I don't need this nap now. They'll cut it and go do something else they need more. Right? They set a plan, monitor progress, and reflect to optimize their own recovery. Right, there's our self-monitoring and then the reflection part. Forgot to bring those up. So now, not every athlete excelled at every skill in this process. So some athletes described an approach that was really planning intensive, mapping things out in greater or more detail ahead of time. But these athletes also tended to talk about learning or needing to learn to be better at adapting their plans, right? Like being able to scale down their workouts when needed, or learning to put aside other activities to prioritize something like taking a rest during the day. On the other hand, other athletes were very attuned to their feelings, described a very adaptable and reactive approach to their days. They had strong expectations about how tired they should feel at different times in the day, the week, the training cycle in general, and they adjusted accordingly. On the other hand, the second type of athlete also tended to want to improve their planning in order to be more proactive about other aspects of recovery. So overall, regardless of the style of regulating recovery, all athletes identified goals related to improving these skills. Now finally, this type of decision making takes a lot of effort, and it can't always be done at 100%. Right? Having the right support makes a huge difference in being able to identify and act on planned recovery. But athletes also changed how dialed in they are throughout the week, the phase, and the year, focusing their efforts on where recovery matters most. So when consequences are the highest, like the periods of intense training camps, or close to a competition, when they have to feel very, very fresh or ready to go. Now, in the long run, though, all athletes talked about learning and developing these recovery skills over the course of their career as they matured, as sport and recovery became more important to them, and as higher training loads required more from them. Now that brings us to what should be done. Now, like I said, these are early results, starting with one group in an ongoing process, but we can definitely suggest a few things. Right? First, recovery involves key skills that have to be developed. Think of them like any psychological skill that we already value and develop for competition. These are just ones that athletes need every day, all year round. So for athletes training to compete and win, this means identifying their recovery strengths, developing their weaknesses, and integrating the athletes into the decision-making processes of their training instead of just informing them afterwards. Now, recognizing that we have to be patient building these skills, they should be incorporated and valued at earlier developmental stages when athletes are learning the other key skills of training and competing, especially surrounding the basics. Now, one word of caution is that we shouldn't expect or even necessarily want high levels of regulation among our developing or train-to-train athletes. Right? When asked about the recovery earlier in their careers, many of the elite athletes I spoke to, they talked about things like hanging out with friends or going to parties that definitely weren't great for physical recovery or performance at the time, But in the long run, being able to enjoy those experiences, a form of longer-term mental recovery maybe, right, while also still being an athlete, help keep them in the sport. So while striving for or to develop regulatory skills in recovery is good, our juniors aren't professionals. Right? It's likely that they shouldn't recover like professionals either. So the second point is that we need to support opportunities for recovery. Recovery takes resources, tools, obviously, but also education, skilled support staff, places for training, and the time and access to use them all effectively. So in the podium pathway, this means pooling resources to provide opportunities for athletes to access them when they need them, right, in that self-directed model, instead of trying to optimize a dozen different silos and try and guess what we think the athletes might want. Right? We can draw on them. Support also means valuing rest. I talk to athletes who are trying to maximize performance in one sport and in one context. On the other hand, we got teenagers in this train to train, or they're trying to spread themselves across a dozen contexts. Leaving one practice, going straight to another isn't rest. Practicing before school, at lunch, then again after, and then going to do homework, it's not a recipe for success. It's probably one for unfulfilled potential at the best. Our balancing demands between contexts allows athletes to keep enjoying and thriving in all of them. So to summarize, recovery isn't constant. It's something we can improve that can deliver better performance and more sustainable participation. Recovery is broad but individual, because it's whatever helps the athlete manage the stress they're experiencing to best execute in their next session. Knowing yourself as a person and athlete is a skill, and we need to support and develop these skills among growing athletes and value them for our elite or mature athletes. I would say that the biggest finding so far from all these interviews, from all this analyzing, all this work has been that athletes want to talk about this. Right? Recovery is obviously really important to them, and they see it as their responsibility to be good at it. This research suggests that empowering and supporting athletes to make better recovery decisions will help lead to better outcomes of long-term sport participation. Thanks for your time.